Let's talk for a few minutes about Greco-Roman backgrounds in terms of culture. In the Roman society, it was a class system. The upper class was called the senatorial class. The senatorial class was only made up of about 600 families. That was actually capped and sort of monitored by the emperor. So if you were in the senatorial class, that was a pretty big deal when you think about the sheer size of the Roman Empire, and only 600 families were considered of the upper class. It was hereditary, obviously, and so we have one example, one prominent example in the Bible. In Acts chapter 13 verse 4, we find that the proconsul of Cyprus, Sergius Paulus, becomes a Christian. If he was the proconsul, that means he had to have been of the senatorial class, and so he probably was the most influential person to become a Christian in the New Testament, as far as we know, and certainly would have been the highest ranking, so to speak, from a social class standpoint. That would have been big, big news in the first century. The second class, or the class right below the senatorial class, would have been the equestrian class. And this was a bit larger, but still it was maintained at about 1,000 families, so it still was not a large class. But those of the equestrian class had quite a bit more freedoms and privileges as a regular person would. But you could move into the equestrian class. You could move up. Typically, you could advance through the army. That'd be one way to do it. The emperor could appoint you to the equestrian class. They got special privileges, things such as special seats at different presentations and events and things of that nature. They could be a governor of a small province. Pontius Pilate would have been of the equestrian class. As would Felix and Festus and Claudius Lysias, different people that are mentioned in the New Testament. These would have been examples of people that were in the equestrian class. Of course, the other class, the lower class, would have been called the plebeians, and of course they really depended on a lot of different things in terms of status, like where you kind of fell. But that was everybody else. You had the very, very, very elite, and then everyone else. When you think about the others, it really kind of depended on where you came from. If you were a Greek from the European area, that was considered higher than if you were Greek but you were from the provinces. If you were a barbarian, in other words, a non-Greek. If your family had nobility or not. If you were a slave or if you were free. How much wealth you had, what your occupation was, your age, your gender. Typically, males had a higher place than females did. So all of these things affected your social status in the first century, much in similar ways as today. I want to say a word about slavery. It is interesting to note 35% of Italy were slaves during the reign of Augustus. Now the thing of it is that you couldn't really tell who was a slave and who wasn't, for multiple reasons. One, slaves did all kinds of jobs. They were accountants. They did a lot of things, a lot of work that perhaps in our understanding of slavery would have been limited maybe just to hard labor. It was not like that. So you couldn't tell who slaves were necessarily by just on the surface. It was not just limited to one ethnicity, so you had a variety of people who served as slaves, and so it was difficult to tell. The sources of slavery came from war, pirates, indentured servitude. You could be born into slavery. Some babies who had been left or exposed, as you would say, were taken into slavery. People convicted of crimes. And so there's a wide variety of ways that someone could find their way into slavery. But in the Roman Empire, you could actually buy your way out of slavery. So some slaves received money for their work and were able to save their money and to purchase their freedom. There were, of course, many legal limitations for slaves. They could marry but had no control over their wife and children, as an example. They could have slaves of their own. And obviously, if you ran away, you would be treated very harshly, which, again, biblically is interesting because the letter of Philemon was a letter written by Paul to Philemon on behalf of a runaway slave named Onesimus, who had become a Christian, had become a good friend of Paul's, And so Paul was sending Onesimus back to Philemon, as he should have. Onesimus needed to go back and return to his master. And so Paul, in that letter, is appealing to Philemon to really welcome this brother home. And although he does not tell him what to do, the implication is that he would really like him to set him free. But if you think about that, just even thinking of the social implications of Philemon coming back to, or receiving Onesimus back, and what that would have said to his peers, and what that might have said to the peers of Onesimus, you can appreciate, even though we can't understand the background fully, it was very complicated, and Paul handles that situation very wisely and very delicately, which brings the letter of Philemon to life. Thinking about marriage and family in the Roman Empire, certainly the father had the majority of the power. They had this thing called the patria potestas, which basically said the father's power. He had the authority to arrange marriages, to disown children, to sell a child into slavery. He could even kill a child if he wanted. I mean, he had a lot of authority. Obedience ranks very highly in terms of virtues for children. And so when we read the Christian household codes in Ephesians 6, 1 through 4, talking about the obedience of children to parents, that would have resonated. However, the difference was the fact that in Christianity there was a reciprocity built into that, whereas the fathers were not to exasperate their children. That would not have been the situation with the Romans. So we have, when it comes to women, their primary role was seen as childbearing and child rearing. Of course, that varied depending on the province. For example, in Macedonia, women were more out in public. In other provinces, they were actually not allowed out unless their husband said they could. We have writings from different Roman writers that basically talk about how women should basically stay unseen and unheard. Plutarch being one of those. And so we have it's a contrast, so it's hard to say exactly. There wasn't one cultural sort of norm in regards to women, but it seems to have varied some by province. We think about roads and travel. Mobility was greatly increased during the Roman times in the first century. Common language and political stability all added to mobility and the ease with which Christianity could have spread during that time. When you think about roads, the roads would allow people to cover about 16 miles a day walking. Most people traveled walking or with donkeys. If you had a chariot, you were high class, you were rolling in a chariot, then you could probably do 30 to 40 miles a day. A carriage could make probably 30 miles a day. So roads were extensive. Some of those roads are even still around today. The Romans were really great about their roads, much better than we are, I might say. Sea travel was very common and very affordable. It would only cost about 2 denarii for an entire family to go from Alexandria to Athens. And so you could make that trip in as little as 10 days from Rome to Alexandria. The return trip, however, could take 2 months, so going against the wind was much more difficult. And the weather would prohibit shipping lanes from being operational between November and March. And so sea travel, as you think about Acts and Paul's travels and some of the troubles they had, makes a lot of sense when you think about the way things are set up in the Mediterranean. Daily life in Rome. We have a lot of writings and examples of what Rome would have been like in the first century. Rome was primarily made of apartment buildings. There were only 4% of the homes in Rome were single-family dwellings. These apartment buildings were typically 5 to 6 stories tall. They were called insulas. The first floor would have been a shop of some kind, and then the residences would have been stacked on top. They weren't very large, and so we can imagine house churches, if they weren't meeting in the home of a wealthy person, would have been really, really packed in. Probably why Eutychus fell out of the window when Paul was speaking and going on long. There wasn't, I'm sure, a lot of room in that place, and maybe why he fell out the window. Romans would have household gods, or what they called lares. and they would represent deified spirits of heroes or ancestors who had care over their house. They're very superstitious, and so if you look at a Roman home, they would have, a little niche in the wall where they'd have their family gods. If you saw Gladiator, he has Lares that he keeps of his family, and that was very, very Roman, very typical. And so you see that superstition kind of being carried through in terms of their of daily life. The baths we had, most houses did not have their own bathrooms. There were public latrines, so you would go down the street to use the bathroom, also to take a bath or whatever. The baths were enjoyed by all social classes. They're very similar to like a YMCA, where they would have like a hot room, a cold room. People would hang out there, even exercise and socialize. Socially, dinner parties were really the only after dark entertainment. If you were poor, you had to get an invitation to a dinner party. And so, even the word symposium comes from these drinking parties where people would get together and engage in philosophical discussions. When Jesus said in Luke 14 that they should invite the poor to an evening meal, that was very countercultural for the day. So that gives us a little bit of a snapshot. Much more can be said. I could give you some resources if you wish on backgrounds of early Christianity. Ferguson's book on that subject is fascinating and it really unpacks a lot of these things. But this gives you a little bit of a taste of what life would have been like in the early church.